What's up everyone, CloakingDonkey here, and we are back with Camelot Unchained, still trying to figure out all of those juicy details that are scattered across the World Wide Web. In the last episode, I talked about combat, because in an RVR game, let's face it, the combat is probably one of the more important aspects. But you cannot really have combat without abilities, because abilities are what combat consists of, right? Otherwise we would just be hitting each other with auto attacks. So how are abilities different in Camelot Unchained to other MMORPGs? The first way in which they are different is that abilities are not gained like you would gain them in other games. Be it the more recent method of just leveling up and suddenly gaining a new ability, or the more old school setup of leveling up and then having to go to a trainer and buying or learning the ability. Instead, in Camelot Unchained, you do not learn full abilities, you only learn what's called components, because abilities are actually not set in stone. You build your abilities yourself. And these components that you receive can be relatively freely combined. There are some rules to it, of course, but for the most part, you can combine most components with most other components. There are 4 basic types of components. They vary slightly depending on class and functionality of that class. For example, archers are slightly different in their components, but for the most part, they adhere to the 4 types that are effect, shape, modifications, and augmentations. An effect is just that, it's an effect. For example, now in the game this is a little bit more specific. To give you an example, we'll take the Flame Warden from the Arthurian realm. And we already know one of that class's effects, namely Primal Fire. And Primal Fire reads, deals high direct fire damage and applies a fire debuff that deals moderate fire damage over time for a brief duration. Now that could be an ability in another game, but usually you need more information than that. It would have a cast time, and it would say how you target it, and how long the range is and all that sort of thing, but all of those are determined by other components. So Primal Fire by itself really doesn't do anything, you have to give it a shape. And in the case of the Flame Warden, we know of the shapes Bolt and Siege Ball. Bolt, for example, is a long-range direct projectile that tracks toward a hostile target and builds additional pyroclastic overcharge. Now, whatever pyroclastic overcharge is completely irrelevant, but we can see that this is basically a ranged attack that homes towards the target, right? It tracks toward a hostile target. So you're still going to have to sort of aim this ability, but it is going to automatically track the target, which means you are not going to have to 100% snipe him from across the field. And that is what I was talking about in the combat video, with some abilities having these tracking options and other abilities not having them. Because if we take the Siege Ball, for example, it becomes a large, slow-moving, arcing projectile with a long activation time that explodes on impact and deals bonus damage to structures and deployable objects. We are still combining it with Primal Fire, so upon impacting it is still going to deal a high amount of direct fire damage and applying a fire debuff that deals moderate fire damage over time for a brief duration. And once we combine an effect with a shape, we have created an ability. Everything else is pretty much optional. We can stop at this point, or we can keep going and add modifications and augmentations. In the case of the Flame Warden again, we have the Circle of Power, which immobilizes the caster and grants increased power to fire magic abilities based on the current amount of pyroclastic overcharge. As a payoff of this ability doing so much more damage, at the same time it immobilizes us for a certain amount of time. It doesn't exactly say how long, but let's just say it'll root us for, I don't know, 5 to 10 seconds. And this is how you have to think about pretty much all of these modifications. They are always going to add something to your spell, but at the same time they are going to cost something. So this spell adds more power, so it's just going to deal more damage, but at the same time it has a drawback that you have to pay for. And this is basically so that you don't just keep slapping more and more modifications onto your spell to turn it into a ridiculous spell. Because if you want that ridiculous spell, you will also have to pay quite the ridiculous cost for it. Be it a root such as this, or be it self-damage. setting yourself on fire, making yourself unhealable, or just something pedestrian like increasing the cast time or the cooldown or the resource cost. Now, of course, this doesn't just work for spellcasters, this works for melee classes and healers just the same. Of course, most melee classes aren't going to have effects like fire or ice, but they do have weapons, don't they? And that's exactly how it works for melee classes. Effects for melee classes are basically the weapon you are using. We can see this, for example, with the Abbot, who has the Quarterstaff as their weapon. A deceptively powerful melee weapon which strikes quickly and deals crushing damage along with high disruption damage. And there we have our effect. When you use this weapon with a shape, which in the case of melee characters are styles, then this weapon will deal crushing damage along with high disruption damage. And in this way it works for pretty much all the classes. Now, the other difference between this and other games is the way you get your abilities, because as I said, because recently it has definitely become trendy to just grant abilities upon level up. So as soon as you hit level 4, you immediately get the appropriate ability for level 4. Back in the day, it used to be that you had to go to trainers. Even modern games such as World of Warcraft used to have trainers that you had to visit to buy the new spells and abilities that you would gain for leveling up. Camelot Unchained is going to bring trainers back, but it is going to bring them back in a slightly different fashion. So when you want to learn a new ability component, you have to go to a trainer. These trainers are most likely going to be located in the capital cities. You go to this trainer and you pick the component you want to learn, and then you immediately get this component. However, the component will be at a lower power than is normal for this component, because to unlock its full potential you first have to use it a bunch. So you put it into your abilities and then you have to play the game to basically level up this component. Now, exactly how long this is going to take, we don't know. We've not actually seen any numbers on this. But this will be a major part of progression in Camelot Unchained, leveling up all sorts of components for your abilities. Now, as soon as you have mastered this ability component, you are allowed to go back to the trainer and pick a new one. You can only get one at a time and have to complete your training in this ability before you can start training in another ability. Because of this, you are going to have to specialize within your class as well, at least for a time. And unless there are any decaying mechanics, at some point you're probably going to have every ability component mastered. But as you are progressing with your character, there are going to be choices that you have to make in which abilities you want to go for. So let's say you're a heavy fighter, you're going to have to choose if you want to go for those shield abilities first, or if you want to go for the more offensive abilities that you would use with your two-handed weapons. Now, this isn't necessarily going to bar you from the other abilities, but they are going to be weaker. And I really like this system, if I'm honest, because I think it kind of creates the same thing that a talent system would create. With, let's say, for example, World of Warcraft's old talent system, you would specialize in one direction. For example, as a warrior, you would specialize in protection, and you would gain a whole bunch of abilities that would really make your tanking much better, but you would be absolutely rubbish on offense with your two-handed weapons or your dual wield. And this system sounds very similar to that, just without you having to actually put points in really boring talents like +1 critical strike, and instead you actually choosing the ability components that will make abilities you want to use and using them a bunch to train yourself in them and become better at them. I hope I explained this right, because I have to say I really love this part of the ability system and think it is a great idea for turning all of this customization for your character into something that's a little bit more involved and interesting than just, as I said, putting points into skill nodes that each give 1% of something. There are other interesting implications for this system, because this could also mean, while there are trainers in the capital city that are going to have most of the important components for your class, there might also be hidden trainers out in the wild that could have really crazy and interesting components for your class, and you would have to find them, learn the abilities from them, and then gain some really interesting direction within your class. Now, I'm not saying this is confirmed, okay? There were some hints at systems like this being really interesting, but we don't know if we're going to see this at launch. This might be a thing that comes down the line. It is, however, very, very cool and would definitely make a good addition to this game. Alright guys, that's pretty much everything there is to know currently about the abilities in Camelot Unchained. In the next episode, we're going to talk about the air system, because combined with the combat and the ability system, it kind of makes that trifecta of why Camelot Unchained really is different. And so I thought it would be good to get those three out of the way first. So look forward to that. But until then, I've been the CloakingDonkey, and I'll see you in another video.